I'm glad to see there's a good Chinatown contingent here. This is good to see. So my name is Patrick, and I started work on this book, the sort of project that became this book, 4 years ago this summer. I had just finished law school, and I was studying for the bar exam in New York, actually, at NYU Law School, which is just over there. And I was in the library trying to concentrate on studying for the bar, which is not an easy thing to do, in July. And Sister Ping was on trial downtown at that time, and the press was covering it. And there were these interesting stories about this woman who had been what is known in China as a snakehead, or a human smuggler. She had, for a price, she would bring people illegally from one country to another, and generally from her home province, Fujian province in southeast China, just across the strait from Taiwan, to New York City. And she had done this initially with her close family members, and then people from her village, and then people from surrounding villages, and then people from the larger area. And over the course of years, she had brought a lot of people to America this way. And what was really intriguing to me about this case was that the government was making her out to be kind of a godfather figure, a sort of a pretty reprehensible human being who had been really motivated by greed and had been pretty ruthless and had engaged in all kinds of organized crime here in New York. But in Chinatown, she actually remained a fairly popular figure. People were watching the case very closely as it went down in New York, and she actually had a lot of support in Chinatown and also in China. And that sort of disconnect was part of what appealed to me initially, this idea that here was this person who was providing a service. It was an illegal service. I mean, she was violating the law by bringing people out of China without the proper documentation and around the world, generally through a whole series of different way stations. I mean, from Thailand to Kenya to Guatemala, and then eventually to the United States. And these journeys were often incredibly perilous, hazardous journeys. I mean, in the introduction, you heard, in some instances, a kind of a 17,000-mile journey. One of the ships that I'm going to talk a little bit about, the Golden Venture, had actually been at sea for 120 days by the time the passengers got here. They'd been in the hold of this ship for 120 days. And that didn't mean anything to me. I didn't give it much thought. But if you think about it, it was 300 people in a space, probably if we started at the shelf there and connected to the wall over there, would be smaller than this space for 120 days. And I was trying to find kind of historical analogs for other big voyages, and I thought, well, what about the Mayflower that came to Plymouth with all the pilgrims in it in 1620? How long were they at sea? And they were at sea for 60 days, and the people on the Golden Venture for 120. The problem is that some of these ships weren't seaworthy, and sometimes they would overturn. And people would go into debt to pay really enormous fees in order to come here to the United States. In the 1980s, the fee generally that you had to pay a snakehead to come to America from Fujian province was $18,000. By the 1990s, when they'd started moving people in boats, ironically, the price hadn't gone down, it had gone up, and the fee was actually $35,000. To give you a sense of this, in the 80s, when the Fujianese first started coming, Chinatown traditionally had been a very Cantonese community, and the Cantonese kind of looked down their noses a little bit at the Fujianese when they first started arriving. There was this sort of a slang. They would say that the Fujianese were $18,000 men because they had paid that much in order to come here. And what I thought I'd do, what I'm going to do is just read kind of a little bit and then talk a little bit, read a little bit, talk a little bit, and then we can open it up. Is just talk a little bit about this community that started emerging really in the early 1980s. On the eastern fringe of Chinatown. So those of you who know Chinatown, we're talking really east of the Bowery. The traditional Cantonese Chinatown was kind of west of the Bowery. But in these streets east of the Bowery, a lot of Fujianese started putting down roots. And Sister Ping herself came in 81, came legally in 81, and started bringing people. And she was kind of a focal point in that community. And what would happen is basically people would come and they would work around the clock in order to pay off this debt that they'd accrued. There's a misconception, which is that a snakehead smuggles you over. You pay a snakehead to smuggle you over. Of course, you don't have $35,000 up front, so you give them a little down payment. The misconception is you would get here and you'll often hear that people were slaves for years to their snakeheads. that the snakeheads would basically force them into indentured servitude. And that wasn't really the way it worked, because if you think about it from the snakehead's point of view, if you're a smuggler and you're bringing a lot of people over, once they get here, you don't want to have to keep track of all these different people who owe you money for years. So what would happen is people would generally have about 72 hours to pay the balance of the debt when they arrived here. And this is where things get a little bit tricky, is that during that 72-hour period, they were often held by gangsters, and sometimes they were held at gunpoint. And if they couldn't satisfy the rest of the debt, sometimes harm was done to them or to their family members. But most people were actually able, through a lot of hard work, to pay off the fee in about a year or two. And so I'm just going to read you a little bit about this, this community and the role that Sister Ping kind of developed in it. By working long hours and living frugally, the Fujianese managed to save. Because their labor was off the books, it was also tax-free, and most Fujianese arrivals were able to pay off their snakehead debt within a couple of years. Despite, or perhaps because of, the depredations, the Fujianese forged a strong, insular, ethnic enclave on the fringes of Chinatown. After 6, or often as many as 13 consecutive days of work, most new arrivals took a day of rest, known as a cigarette day, to shop, recreate, and gamble, to indulge in a few simple luxuries, like cigarettes. Monday is traditionally a slow day in the restaurant trade, and after a week of slicing broccoli or pushing a mop, young men would wend their way through the hurly-burly of East Broadway, past the fishmongers and video shops, the storefront grocers with their bushels of fruit, their plastic vats of dried mushrooms, their mountains of red lychees. As often as not, they would end up at the Takshun variety store. This was Sister Ping's first shop on Hester Street, really not far from here, where Sister Ping presided, asking after family members, advising youngsters to learn English, though she wouldn't do so herself, and generally accumulating relationships, or guangxi, the Chinese expression that entails connections, the kind of interlocking favors and dependencies that bind a community together. Local Fujianese began to visit Sister Ping when they needed help or advice. A restaurant worker named Ming Wang, who had lost his job because of an injury and could expect no compensation from his employer, once visited Sister Ping and explained his predicament. "Little brother, take this," she said, handing him $2,000. "Pay me back when you can." 3 times a year she made trips to Hong Kong to buy merchandise, and often she was accompanied on the plane by the American-born babies of illegal Fujianese from the neighborhood. These were parents that didn't have legal INS status in the USA and needed someone to bring their children to China, she explained. I would do it for them, free of charge. I'll just interject, this is one of the ironies, is people would go to great lengths to get out of China and come here, often illegally. And then they would get here and they would have babies who were born in the United States, so they're US citizens. And then the first thing that everybody wanted to do was send the babies back to China. And part of the reason for this is just that people were working so much, really around the clock, and for so little pay that they didn't necessarily have the funds to take care of the children. So what they would do is send them back to China to be raised by their grandparents in the ancestral village until they were old enough for elementary school in the US. So it's weird, you have this traffic going in one direction coming to the US, and then people get here and then send their babies back in the other direction. And Sister Ping was active in both of these, lanes. Sister Ping ran the store and oversaw the books. She was the dominant partner, with her husband, Yik Tak, always hovering in the background. Almost as soon as she arrived in Chinatown in 1981, it seemed, she became a well-known, well-respected figure, notable for working hours in her store that were long even by Chinatown standards, for demonstrating a distinctly Fujianese interest in and acumen for business, and for maintaining a modest demeanor and a simple, indulgence-free way of life, even as she became an entrepreneurial success story. I was credible, she would later say, when asked about her status in the neighborhood. I had a conscience. I did things for free, as favors. I treated relatives and friends well. I know it's difficult for people to be in a foreign land with few acquaintances. She also developed a reputation during these years as someone who could move people. And at this point, the book goes into describing the way in which Sister Ping started out in business as a snakehead. Initially, it was a very hands-on operation. She would be bringing people in 1s and 2s. Often they were taking planes with phony documents of some sort. And she would often accompany them on different legs of the journey. But what happened is she was so good at it that she gained a reputation in the marketplace for being a really good snakehead and became more and more popular, and there was more and more demand. And particularly after 1989, there was a huge boom And a lot of people wanted to come to the United States, wanted to leave China. And so business just got very good for Sister Ping and for numerous other snakeheads. Nobody knows the actual numbers of people who came in this way during this period. But I mean, to give you a sense, the CIA estimated in 1995 that roughly 100,000 people were coming illegally from Fujian province to the United States in this manner.